Hello, my name is Alexander Harris, and I'm a graduate student at Western Washington University. Today, I'm going to be giving a brief overview of my graduate research project and reviewing some of the methodology and the research techniques that I'll be using to investigate community forestry. I'll share my screen and enter here. The focus of my research project is the Stewart Mountain Community Forest, which is a collaborative effort amongst numerous stakeholders here in Whatcom County to develop a community forest. I'll be getting into more detail later, but throughout the presentation, remember that this is my focus and everything else I'll be talking about relates to this one focus area. So here's a brief overview of what I'll be addressing. I'll give a quick introduction and some background information about the South Fork watershed. I will run through some of the literature that I've been reviewing to build my research project and design my methodology. And then I'll actually get into the methods. The last section will be what kind of methods I'll be using and what the timeline is for my research. So starting at the top with the introduction. My research question for this project is which model of community forestry is most conducive to restoring the Nooksack watershed and recovering salmonid populations? Sounds like a pretty complex question, but we're going to be unpacking that, so hopefully it'll make more sense at the end. To begin, this is the South Fork Valley. This is where my partner and I live here in the community of Van Zant. I took this photo from Stewart Mountain looking east towards Mount Baker and the Twin Sisters. The South Fork watershed is one of the three major forks of the Nooksack watershed here in northwestern Washington. And it's a very important watershed for a lot of different purposes, for salmon, for native people, for recreation, and for numerous industries. There's a major agricultural and timber industry in the watershed. And there's also communities that live here and depend on the watershed for a variety of uses. You can see on this map, this is a map from the Department of Ecology. Everything that's in red or yellow is a fish-bearing stream. Some of these waterways, in fact, most of the yellow or red, are going to be open to anadromous salmonids. So anadromous meaning ocean-faring salmon and steelhead populations, whereas the blue on this map are non-fish-bearing streams. This is the upper South Fork where a lot of the salmon spawning actually takes place. It's closed to most commercial fishing and most recreational fishing because of how crucially critically endangered a lot of these fish populations are. This is a very important area to both the Lummi and Nooksack tribes, and historically was a major location where hundreds of people would gather during the fish runs to fish. And of course, we know Salish Sea peoples depended on fish not only for sustenance and their economy, but also spiritually and culturally. Salmon were a very important part of their cultures and still are. Here's the lower South Fork. This is right next to where I live. This is Potter Road Bridge, if you know the area. The lower South Fork, you can see, is much wider. Still runs clear most of the year, but there's definitely a lot more sediment in the river by this point because of cumulative impacts. This differs starkly from, this is a picture of the North Fork. This is actually downriver of the confluence of the North and Middle Forks. So this is near the community of Welcome. Notice how the glacial till in this water is so different than what you see here in the South Fork. And the reason is because the South Fork watershed has some glaciers that feed the watershed, but essentially none. It's a very negligible amount. So in other words, most of the watershed is fed from snowpack and rain and aquifers. And those sources all really, there's just not a lot of snow melt or aquifer fed in-stream flow by the late summer. So the South Fork is known for really having a lot less water in the late summer, and that of course is a major issue to fish species. Here is a video taken by a friend of mine of Chinook salmon in the South Fork, just a few miles from where I live. He got this footage, and you can see here Chinook salmon migrating upstream to spawn. The South Fork is a very important restoration priority because glaciers do not feed this watershed. Climate change is already contributing to less and less snowpack. So in the next few decades, less and less water in this waterway is going to be a major impediment to fish populations, in particular Chinook salmon that you see here. This is really important also in the North and Middle Forks, but they have so many more glaciers that they have a few more decades before they hit crisis. They're in crisis mode. Scientists expect that the latter half of the 21st century is when those watersheds will experience major in-stream flow deficits, and salmon could also be impacted by that. So I've been talking about salmonids. Let me briefly explain what I'm even talking about. Notice on the left, this is the salmonid family. I've broken this chart down by genus. So notice the Oncorhynchus. These are all of our 5 Pacific salmon: chum, chinook, sockeye, coho, and pink. Those are the 5. And then there's also 2 more of this same genus. Those are the steelhead trout and the cutthroat trout. All of these are in the South Fork watershed, as well as these native char populations, bull trout and Dolly Varden, very closely related, but there is a distinction. You can also find other species that are not native in the watershed, but these ones that I just went over are all the native populations. Native fish in the Northwest are steeply declining, and experts generally agree for the reasons: habitat and water quality, fish impairments or passage impairments being the most important. It's essentially habitat. Fish are not able to gain access to spawning grounds. Their habitat has been degraded, the water quality has been degraded, and the result is very stunning. We've seen over the last 5 decades a steep decline in fish populations. As experts expect that fish in the Northwest, native fish populations in the Salish Sea, are roughly 10% of their historical numbers before European settlement. So we know it's capitalism and other industrial processes that have contributed to this problem. There is debate about what has contributed the most and what has been the most important. Well, today I'll be getting into one of those major variables, which is the degradation of habitat through forest degradation. As science has matured over the last several decades, we've learned that salmon are an old growth species. In other words, we usually think of the spotted owl or the marble murrelet or other endangered species as old growth species that depend on old, mature forest. But science is now also telling us that salmon also depend on mature forest, both to shade the forest and keep it cool, and to mitigate the amount of mudslides, sediment flows, mass wasting that contributes to high levels of turbidity and degrades habitat. So all the pictures that are in this presentation, I actually took. So you don't have to worry about me sourcing any of these. On the left, you'll see the South Fork experiencing some solar radiation. South Fork is an impaired waterway under the Clean Water Act. It actually violates the Clean Water Act under Section 303D. It's an impaired waterway for being too hot. the temperatures are too hot. Picture on the right is also of the South Fork, and you'll notice during times of the year, the river runs brown. It's chock full of sediment and mud. And the South Fork is also impaired for excessive amounts of turbidity. In other words, too much sediment in the water. The South Fork is also impaired for stream flow, meaning there's not enough water in the late summer in particular. And there are a variety of reasons that is, but as we'll get into, industrial forestry plays a major role there. The Nooksack tribe, working with other partners, has developed a series of log jams. These are engineered log jams, ELJs they're called in the field. And you'll notice one here. They are trees, trunks and boles of trees that are drilled into the ground and strung together by metal cables. And they allow fallen trees and debris to be caught like this, which contributes to greater sinuosity and greater complexity in the way that the river flows. The stream channel morphology has been greatly altered by agriculture and industrial forestry, and the tribe and other partners are trying to ameliorate that problem by blocking up the river in some areas and contributing to a more migratory and meandering shape of the river, if you will. Okay, so that was a really quick overview of the South Fork. Let me get into some of the literature regarding industrial forestry and the role it plays in contributing to salmon habitat or degrading salmon habitat. So industrial forestry, as I will be demonstrating, has led to a decline in salmon populations. There really is no debate about that in the scientific community. That's objectively true. It's just a matter of how much that's been the case. And that is up for debate. The South Fork, as I went over, violates the Clean Water Act for temperature, turbidity, and water quantity. There are alternatives being explored that are not regulatory, but traditionally, to improve forest practices, the laws have essentially needed to be changed. Regulations have needed to be amended. And that is a very lengthy, complex process. It's politically toxic. Industry hates regulation and does everything they can to keep things as they are and not increase the amount of regulation that they have to deal with. And there are a lot of valid reasons that they dislike regulation. But the slow pace of regulation has contributed to people in the field looking for alternative approaches. In other words, instead of just regulating forestry more, what else could we do to improve forest practices and therefore improve the watershed? This is a clear cut on Stewart Mountain. That is one of the freshest clear cuts. I took this in the fall. This is my buddy. We were on a bike ride and stumbled upon this clear cut. This is, I think, about 120, 115 acres. I forget the actual acreage, but this is one of the larger clear cuts that have recently happened. And you can see a clear cut is exactly what it sounds like. It is a complete annihilation of all vegetative matter across a large swath of land. So all plants are killed uniformly and replanted as plantations. And they are sprayed routinely in their first few years to ensure that no other vegetation grows except for the target crop. The Doug fir is usually what it is. So you can see here a blanket of Doug firs on Stewart Mountain. This contributes to very dense stands growing with essentially no understory. There really is a single species throughout their lifetime until they're clear cut and the process starts again. These are known as plantations. So what does the scientific literature say? Well, I'll go over a few different angles of the impacts, the hydrologic impacts of industrial forestry, but by no means is this an exhaustive list of the literature. One of the focal points of my research will be on hydrologic maturity and the role that it plays in contributing to higher stream flow levels in the late summer. So that's a lot of jargon. Let me unpack that a little bit. Currently, a lot of waterways in the Northwest are running too dry in the summer. There's just not enough water. That's a water quantity issue. And scientists have been able to figure out a few different reasons for why that is, climate change being one of those reasons. But more pronounced, in at least at our time, in the 21st century, is the role that plantations have on watersheds. So scientists, two different studies conducted in Oregon, one in 2020, one in 2017, they each analyzed different experimental forests in Oregon that had been set aside for research back in the 50s. And they looked at 60 years of data. One of the studies looked at 60 years of data in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest near Eugene and the South Umpqua Experimental Forest near Roseburg. And they found that when comparing the stream flow levels with the logged basin and the unlogged basin, stream flows were 50% lower in the logged basin than they were in the unlogged basin. So in other words, they clear cut one basin, they left the other one alone, and they watched those waterways for 6 decades in these two different parts of the state. And they found the same thing, 50% less water where logging had taken place. Then in 2020, there was another study that was conducted in a different area with a different set of multi-decadal data, and they corroborated the study. Groundbreaking study, and it has had major implications in forest policy so far. This diminished stream flow doesn't just last for 3 or 5 years. It actually lasts for multiple decades. The scientists found that starting 20 or 30 years into a plantation's life, there were marked declines in stream flow levels, and that persisted for decades. So to translate that into what it means for us, clear cutting today is actually contributing to stream flow deficits for decades to come. And those decades to come, of course, are going to be characterized by climate destabilization, by glacial retreat, by a steep decline in snowpack. Much more precipitation will fall as rain, much less will fall as snow. There is also a lot of science about the role that industrial forest practices have on stream flow, water quality. So we just went over quantity, right? How much water there is. There's also been a lot of research showing that industrial logging contributes to lower quality of water. There's one study, science synthesis, that I'm very fond of. It was conducted by the US Forest Service in 2008. And instead of doing primary research, it synthesizes over 100 peer-reviewed articles that are studying this exact question. And it really is, so far in my research, the most comprehensive summary of the literature and where it stands in regards to industrial logging and water quality. No surprise, industrial logging contributes to increases in peak flows. Peak flow is basically the opposite of summer stream flow. Summer stream flow is when the water is lowest, and peak flows are when the water is highest. So these are when flood events happen. This is when landslides and mass wasting happen. And these kinds of peak flow events can actually contribute to more channelization of the river, so less meandering of the river. That can also lead to warmer temperatures. It eliminates a lot of the vegetation along the banks. So you have bigger beaches without vegetation that is shading the river. So it actually can increase temperature. And of course, this increases sediment in the water. The more landslides, the more mass wasting, the more turbidity that will be affecting salmon. Okay, so we can get into that in greater detail later. For today's purposes, let's now move on to alternatives to the industrial model. What are the alternatives? Well, ecological forestry is the blanket term for the alternative approach to silviculture that does not require clear cutting and plantations and aggressive herbicide spraying and whatnot. Essentially, long-term watershed restoration requires long-term commitment to forest stewardship. So you need to take the long view. You need to think of a forest in tree years, not in human years, not in Wall Street years. That's the most important difference. You advance selective thinning and other kinds of silvicultural approaches that increase biodiversity, increase diversity of structures and tree ages, and most importantly, increase the complexity of the forest. Think of a plantation as being uniform and simple and homogeneous. It's very different than a natural forest, which is complex and diverse and ever-changing. Ecological forestry is not just leave it alone. You can manage a forest and increase diversity and increase tree vigor and forest health through a variety of techniques and still produce wood products while leaving a forest behind. You can leave an understory, you can leave other trees behind and still obtain economic value. And that's the whole idea, balancing economic goals with other goals. Community forestry fits very well into that. Community forestry is a way of democratizing natural resource management. It's a way of managing a forest for numerous values and uses without prioritizing just one, such as timber production. It's also a way of engaging a community to really figure out what their priorities are, and then establishing a management regime that reflects the community's values. Ideally, this would be democratic and open to different voices and different interests. And there would be certain people who don't want to log the forest, and there would be certain people who want to log it more. And ideally, you'd find some way to log certain areas. Certain areas would be prioritizing timber production. Other areas, there'd be some timber production, but there would also be trails and there would also be habitat restoration. And then other areas, say like right along waterways, would not be logged. They'd be conservation areas for wildlife and for watershed health. It's a nuanced and complex way to manage a forest, but that's what we need. That's what climate change and salmon recovery demand in order to be successful. The Stewart Mountain Community Forest is a proposed community forest here in Whatcom County. And I'm working closely with Whatcom Land Trust, the Nooksack Tribe, Evergreen Land Trust, and Whatcom County to advance this project. I'm trying to get Western Washington to be more involved, the university. And so far, folks at the university have been very interested in getting more involved. The community forest would be a working forest that continues to produce wood products while balancing a range of ecological, economic, and community benefits. So we already went into this. The chief goal of the community forest would be to restore the South Fork watershed and recover salmonid populations through improved forest practices. But there are also other goals. Some of those goals are to promote economic development, expand recreational access, produce high quality, large diameter wood products, and bolster community autonomy. So notice Bellingham on the left and Mount Baker on the right. This is where I live in the community of Van Zant. You can see all the blue lands here are DNR, all of the golden brown, and maybe that's an orange. That's all county land. And then everything else that's not highlighted in the color on this map is private. You'll notice federal in green off here on the right. But all these unshaded lands, those are private. The area that we are trying to acquire for a community forest is right here. So it's between the South Fork Valley and Lake Whatcom on the eastern side of Stewart Mountain. And to show you from a different angle, here's Lake Whatcom, there's Bellingham in the distance, and this is Stewart Mountain. Here's the South Fork right here, and you can see the North Fork here. This is where the confluence is, and they run that way. Another angle to show you the area we're looking at, I made this map to show phase 1 of the community forest. This is the first 500 acres that we're trying to buy. And we've written now 2 grants to try to acquire this forest. So where does my research fit into this larger picture? And what is my research going to do? Well, the basic questions that are guiding the research are, what are the various models of community forestry? What are the advantages and drawbacks of each model? And which model is most conducive to the Stewart Mountain Community Forest goals? This is a timetable of how I will implement my research project. So starting at the top, this is phase 1 of my research project. Design the research project, do a preliminary assessment of the literature, recruit a graduate research committee, pursue research grants, and defend the research proposal. So this is all what I'm doing this year, my first year of grad school. I'm also starting in the spring to conduct my inventory. I'll be identifying every single community forest in the Northwest and developing at least a spreadsheet with data and information about each one. I'll then create a typology that categorizes these different community forests based on who owns the land and how they're managed. And after I categorize them, this will be phase 3. I will identify 1 case example from each categories. And I'm going to shoot for 6 categories, 6 case examples. I'll build a case example profile for each one that really gets into depth on how the forest is managed, who it's owned by, how they balance all these different values, how they engage the community, how democratic really is it. Then I will, before I get into that next step, I will have to do a lot of interviews for this part of the research project. I'll also be conducting site visits and reviewing some of the planning documents to build each of these profiles. Then I conduct my analysis, and this is probably the area that I'm least clear on. I'm still developing my evaluation criteria and figuring out how I'm going to conduct this analysis. But essentially, I distill the key variables that are conducive to each model, figure out what the advantages and the drawbacks are of each model. And the goal is to produce a final recommendation that has been informed by all this research that I've done. And the recommendation would be handed over to the stakeholders who I'm working with. And it would basically be a path forward. It wouldn't necessarily be the path forward. It would just be my recommendation for how stakeholders should advance the community forest, which entity should own it, how it should be governed, and how the forest should be managed. How much timber should come off the mountain? How much conservation and restoration do we need to prioritize? It would be a more generalized strategy for how the community forest could move forward. So that's the entirety of my project, at least as it currently stands. Here's my works cited. You're able to pause this if you're watching this recorded and review some of my works cited. To close, I believe community forestry can be a really powerful and effective tool to restore salmon and watershed and water quality, while also advancing other goals such as rural economic development, timber production, and here in Whatcom County, especially recreation. There's major recreation potential here. Hopefully some of the pictures I showed you demonstrated how amazing this place is and how it actually has a lot of potential to serve the community in so many more ways than it currently is. So with that, that's everything. I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thanks.